I'm going to try to convince you in about 12 minutes that you ought to consider the possibilities these two groups of organisms, snakes and primates, can be a very dangerous conversation for them. Louder?
Yep, now louder.
Even louder?
Yep.
Whoa. Louder? Louder? Does that help?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Well, I'm going to try to convince you in the next 12 minutes, as fast as I can, that on the one hand, snakes like this 4-meter king cobra and this 3-meter boa constrictor in the litter here have been having a very dangerous conversation for about 80 million years with primates like this bonnet macaque and the Cephas monkey here. Act 1 of this story is Lynn Isbell's theory of snake detection, in which she sort of couples the origin of visual specialization in primates with two major events in snake evolution. The first of these two events is the origin of primates, at which point there were already large mouth constricting snakes present, such that animals like this 3-meter southern African python have no trouble eating this vervet monkey. On the other hand, about 50 million or so years after that, with the origin of anthropoids, it turns out that slightly before the origin of anthropoids, we got front fangs evolving 3 different times in snakes. And there's a sort of a second wave of visual adaptations that show up in primates shortly after the origin of front fangs, sort of exemplified here by these juvenile savanna baboons watching this large black mamba crawl through their group. The evidence for this is diverse. Just to say a little bit about the origin of primates. Compared to our closest relatives, tree shrews and colugos, as well as other mammals, we have bigger brains, we have orbital convergence. Unlike rodents, for example, which actually steer their grasping of their paws towards a food source by chemical cues, we steer our hands with visual cues. All these adaptations, plus others, were enhanced with the origin of anthropoids, including some very snake-specific neural mechanisms, such as some pulvinar neurons I'll talk about in just a minute. Some of these mechanisms are conscious and some are preconscious. So, for example, it turns out we have a neural pathway in which, prior to any conscious knowledge of it, we recognize snakes. That information goes to superior colliculus, called the tectum in other animals, straight to the pulvinar and then to the amygdala, which is the fear center of the brain. Here's an example of some experimental evidence where recordings were made from various pulvinar neurons, monkeys exposed to a variety of different stimuli, and they just go nuts over snake. There have been all kinds of studies of our ability to recognize and react to various images under variously difficult contexts. So this is under what's called a challenging attentional condition. And in this case, both human children and adult non-human primates react much, much faster, even with only 300 milliseconds of exposure to snake images than they do to either spiders or mushrooms. So what about the snakes? Well, we have really good evidence that more than 100 million years ago there were constricting large mouth, what we call macrostomatin snakes present. So when primates started, snakes were already waiting for them. The kinds of things these snakes can do are illustrated by, on the left here, this is a 3-meter boa in Costa Rica swallowing a white-tailed deer fawn. Here on the right is our second example of a monkey laying in the dust. Here's a 2-meter boa in Brazil, actually, probably weighing about 6 kilograms and swallowing an adult female red howler monkey. These are not big meals for snakes. So pythons and boas can eat meals up to about 100% of their own mass. All right, when we look across the natural history of snakes and primates, some really interesting anecdotes show up. I've now found examples in the natural history literature of snakes not only killing tree shrews and colugos, but also more than 40 species of lemurs and their relatives like galagos and lorises, but also tarsiers, monkeys, and apes. There are no snakes that specialize on primates, but there are a number of big snakes that regularly eat primates. These include boa constrictors, particularly pythons, African pythons, and Madagascan ground boas. I think it's quite possible that within the individual life of a particular python, it might eat tree shrews, colugos, several species of macaques, an occasional simang, and once in a while a person. This is a really interesting example here. This was a large adult female Madagascan ground boa named Big George, and she lived for about a decade around the grounds of an ecotourist resort in Madagascar. And she was regularly observed to kill and eat lemurs, like this ground lemur she's seen consuming right here. Big George bit the dust about 2 years ago when she attacked the 4th sheepfox lemur in a row of 8 that were crossing in front of her. And when she struck this pregnant female sheepfox, the other 7 sheepfox jumped on her attacked her so fiercely that the attacked female got free enough to bite Big George and fracture her mandible. The pregnant female got loose. Big George starved to death over the next 2 months. Okay, we also have a lot of evidence. The other side of this coin is that we have a lot of evidence that primates kill snakes. So I found records in the natural history literature of lemurs, tarsiers, monkeys, and apes all killing snakes. And of course, we as humans do that. This is a particularly interesting case study by Tom Hedlund in the Philippines, who studied actin negritos in the 1960s when they were still pre-literate hunter-gatherers. It turned out of 58 adult male actin that he interviewed, 26% of them had survived predatory attacks by reticulated pythons. So imagine what that would be like as you're walking through the forest hunting. They act to hunt the pythons, and it turns out when they butcher pythons, like this big, almost 7-meter female, they find in the stomachs of the pythons the same 3 prey species that they concentrate on: macaques, deer, and pigs. So the reticulated pythons and the actin are simultaneously predator, prey, and potential interference competitors. Isn't that pretty cool? Okay, so the next part of the story has to do with what happens with snakes. And we hear a lot of talk about the importance of venom in snake evolution, but I think the really key innovation came somewhat more than 50 million years ago with a freeing up of the palato-maxillary apparatus. So just to give you a tiny bit of snake anatomy, here's the ventral view of the palate of a hognose snake. And what you're seeing here is this right palato-maxillary arch. It's a movable arch on each side of the skull. It consists of a pterygoid bone, a palatine bone, a maxillary bone, and a connecting ectopterygoid. And in really relatively primitive snakes, these bones are quite firmly sutured together such that the whole arch is required for swallowing. About 50 or more million years ago, this arch became greatly freed up and kinetic, such that the whole act of swallowing can take place by the central row of teeth on the palatines and pterygoids, freeing up the maxillary bones for evolutionary specialization. And it's only at this level in the cladogram and above that you get all kinds of specializations for various prey types. You never see it in boas and pythons, you just see it in advanced snakes. That's where you get the evolution of front fangs 3 different times independently. That's a really big deal. So, what do front fangs do for you? Well, they let you very rapidly engage with a potentially dangerous prey item, inject a cocktail of tranquilizing and sometimes tenderizing chemicals, and as a result, eat things weighing up to about 160% of your own mass. So substantially bigger than boas and pythons can do. Some front fangs snakes do in fact eat primates. Here's a gaboon adder that turned out unsuccessfully tried to eat a blue monkey. There are records of black mambas eating galagos and so forth, but there's no doubt, I don't think, that much more frequently what front fang snakes do is bite primates as a defensive measure, as adversaries. It doesn't have to be a very big front fang snake, so sometimes we think of little snakes as being not dangerous. This is an account in the literature of a German herpetologist who was killed by an Asian coral snake about the diameter and length of a typical lead pencil. So I think essentially any front fang snake out there is dangerous to any primate. Now what this means is sort of only interesting, recently become clear, and that is that there's a second big advantage to having front fangs. It's not just with feeding, it also has to do with dealing with your adversaries. If you ever get bitten by a boa or a python or even a big water snake, you'll notice that snake teeth are designed for holding on, not for letting go. And so if a boa or a python strikes an adversary defensively, it immediately has a big problem. It has to disengage from that adversary, during which time it might in fact get killed by the adversary. So what front fangs do is let you do that extremely rapidly. These high-speed video frames over here show that from the time of fang contact with this mouse to the time they're released is about 150 milliseconds from its temporal rattlesnake. So in about 150 milliseconds, you can basically deal with an adversary, get out of the way, leave it with a severe punishment, teach it a lesson. And it's only above this level in the cladogram of snakes that you get all these elaborate defensive signals. You never see this kind of thing in boas and pythons. It's only in this level that you get hoods and rattles and rasping scales and bright colors and so forth, aposematic displays. It's also above that level in the cladogram where you get these extensive mimicry complexes. So you just don't see this before you get the evolution of front fangs. So front fangs was a very big deal, way beyond the 700 species that possess them. Who are the adversaries? Well, that's a big question, and I think herpetologists have tended to assume that birds and mammalian carnivores were the actors. They're relatively smart, they're visual, they're acoustic, and they're cognitive, and I'm sure that's true that they are important. But I'm interested in the possibility that primates might be much more important players than we realize. And that's because primates are not only visual, electrically sensitive, acoustically sensitive, and cognitively sophisticated, but they are also super social, thank you, and they are weapon wielders. Okay, there are actually observations of numerous observations actually of primates throwing things at snakes, beating snakes with clubs, pushing snakes away with sticks. There's an observation in the field of a white-faced capuchin actually killing a big fur lance in Costa Rica with a stick. What's the social thing mean? Well, it means that if you have even one individual in your group who survive a snake bite, the whole story is going to spread. The snakes only have to have a few potentially mortal encounters with an occasional primate to drive this whole thing. So there have been studies of Ecuadorian Amerindians that show that at least 95% of the men have survived at least one snake bite. About 50% of them have survived 2 or more snake bites. Same thing happened with Kim Hill's work with the Paraguayan Ashe. Most males bit at least once, usually from stepping on a snake while searching for a female game. I wish I knew what the rate of snake bite was to wild primates. We don't know that. Maybe we can estimate it by looking at the veterinary literature on dogs. It turns out in the United States, 70 to 99% of dogs survive snake bite, even without treatment. So that suggests that the same might be true for free-living primates. And finally, I've got this really crazy idea that spitting, which has evolved 3 times in cobras, might be Lucy's legacy. That Australopithecines might be the basis for the evolution of the only long-distance weaponry in snakes. I'm speeding up so I can make sure to give my candid friend here all this time. So what to do next? Well, this is one of these things that's just like a narrative. You know, it's a story. How can we get beyond that? And what I'm doing is pushing for increased natural history information to sort of feed this story. One thing that could potentially refute the whole thing is sort of enhanced dating using molecules and fossils, such that, for example, if it turns out that anthropoids are older than front fangs, there goes the idea. Okay. Now, I'm also trying to inspire surveys of free-living primates to find out what the incidence of survived snake bite is in free-living primates. And I just found out about somebody that has several hundred vervet blood samples that we could use the ELISA probes on to ask that question. I've started a primate snake database, and I'm surveying more than 100 field primatologists to provide more natural history evidence. So thanks for your attention. I don't know if I can.